All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, Steve. Nice to have you back.
Hello. Yeah, nice to be back.
I think I'm going to start with an anniversary that is happening these days in Romania. It's actually the anniversary of the 1989 revolution. Since it started in Timișoara, right here, people are really, I don't know, celebrating is a weird word, but remembering. And I was hoping that if I can get you finally one day here visiting, I could show you exactly the building where it began. I bet there aren't many historical events that can be pinpointed like that.
Was it a local sort of government just saying no kind of thing, like resisting in that respect?
They came to arrest a Catholic priest that had been speaking against the government. And apparently when they came to arrest him, a couple of neighbors tried to help him, and from there it just spread like wildfire. But then,
interesting.
A few days ago, 2 days ago, my mother posted one article on Facebook about how the Romanian Revolution started step by step. And I made a bit of a smartest comment there. I said, well, I think it started the way most revolutions start lately, in the office of office of the CIA. So
no, I wouldn't think so. I think my memory of that time period was Romania was certainly opening the doors to outside countries. That the so-called Iron Curtain had gotten pretty porous by that point, hadn't it? I mean, there was markets were starting to move into Romania. No?
They allowed foreign students, usually from countries that had special understandings with our government. But in terms of goods coming into Romanian market, no, that didn't happen.
Were people in Romania able to leave?
No. No?
That's interesting. Okay.
Well, it was, so
yeah, entirely sort of homegrown resistance then. Yeah.
There are a lot of things that don't end up even now, 30 years plus. There were terrorists shooting at people. I mean, on the 17th of December, it was the first time when the shooting started, and they said, I was just reading that 66 people were killed and hundreds wounded. But nobody ever caught them. Nobody knew who these terrorists were.
Interesting.
And the shooting kind of angered the people and rallied more protesters. And there was somebody already there in the chaos after the regime fell. Somebody was there to take over everything, and that's suspicious, to say the least. And then the wave of anti-communist revolutions that just triggered, that too is suspicious.
Well, yeah, I suppose. Ideas are, they don't respect borders at all, and so momentum can be picked up. And I mean, we saw something similar with the Arab Spring, right? When Egypt began its resistance, that it spread to other countries, Libya and then all the way across to Syria and all the rest. So sometimes ideas are, well, sometimes they are the most powerful forces in terms of human culture. And it's a very difficult thing to, in fact, it's historically pretty much impossible to shut that stuff down. There are examples where it has been shut down. I mean, China did it in Tiananmen Square, post-Tiananmen Square. But at the same time, ideas will just, they morph and they travel, and they are powerful forces. And it's similar to, I've been listening to a lot of lectures from David Graeber, who recently passed. I think he died from, I'm not sure if it was COVID related, but he certainly, he's probably in his mid-50s. So a great loss in his dying. Social anthropologist who wrote a book called, well, a number of books, but one called Death, the history of the first 5,000 years. But anyways, I've been listening to a lot of this stuff, and he was big in the Occupy movement in America. And in one of the interviews, he's questioned on when, what exactly happened. How did the Occupy movement get shut down the way it did? And because it was really gathering momentum. And his sort of post-event analysis was basically when it reached the point where it was sufficiently dangerous, because it was a movement that refused to, create political candidates, and refused to be pinned down, because once you're pinned down as an ideology, then you can be targeted much more easily. And so because of that, things got really violent right towards the end, even though these people were very passive in their resistance. They were resisting and the entire system. And so there was not a case of choosing a particular left or right leaning ideology. They were just saying this whole system's fucked. And I think it was recognized probably instinctively, but then later on, quite deliberately, recognized as an existential threat to our entire system, our entire global system. And when that happened, the media attention on it disappeared. And that's how you can shut down a movement. If just nobody knows it's still happening, then it just goes away. So, I mean, there are ways of that authority can shut these things down, and it's a constant battle, if you will. We have it here with the anti-logging movement, and the way in which that is also being shut down by the media, actually not being allowed to even be present at the protests. The journalists get arrested and thrown in the back of vans. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff going on right now, and it's pretty disturbing in many respects.
Agreed. Well, there were quite a few moments back then, some sad, some saving. Some of these stories I've actually heard back then when I was just 9-year-old when it happened. So people were talking around. I tried to do research to see if there's any information online. I couldn't get anything. There was an incident on the 22nd, which was really a bloodbath in Timișoara. When the shooting started, the people sent their children to the cathedral, which is an icon of the city. But the high priests there, the ranking priests, they were named by the party, and they were afraid that if the regime doesn't fall and they were seen taking sides, they would get in trouble. So they kept the doors closed, and all those children were gunned down on the stairs of the cathedral.
Wow. I'm then astonished that the church has any power left in that country. That's extraordinary.
Ridiculously, the same people who are in power then in the church are still there in power, and the religious people still worship them as everything's right. The atheist community is frustrated because apparently there's been evidence brought that the church is participating in money laundering for the politicians. But the religious community, and that's the majority, they don't want to listen, they don't want to hear. Church is God and God is church, and there's no distinction.
Yeah.
And then, speaking of important moments, I think this one actually happened in the capital when they decided to use the army to shoot at the population. They say that one single soldier said no, and the general behind him put a gun at his head and said, "You either do it, or I won't even court-martial you, I'll kill you right here." And that was the point where the other soldiers dropped their weapons, and one of them informed the general that he's arrested, and then the people started chanting, "The army is with us," and that was the end of it.
And that's the end of it. Yeah, often the case. When the army says no, that's when it all falls down. It's because, I mean, so much of this, political control is is founded upon the threat of coercion, and your army is your instrument of coercion. So once that disappears, then it's all revealed to be just a chimera. It just disappears. So and here in BC, we're having this problem because it's a labor style government, but it is actually behaving in a way that you would think a far right government would behave. It's the suppression of the protesters, and a lot of the protesters are indigenous, and they just get rounded up because they're trying to stop the logging. I mean, we're down to 1%, I think, of old growth forest here on the island, and they're trying to save these 1,000-year-old 1,500-year-old trees, because we cannot get that ecosystem back, and it's an extraordinary carbon sink. It's a thing worth fighting for, and unfortunately the RCMP are basically working on behalf of the logging companies rather than the citizens of our country. So and that is it's expressing something, it's showing something that's very fascistic in its behavior, where the law enforcement is actually not working in the interest of the people of the province, but in the interest of basically a private corporation. And we're here in Canada, and you think, well, how can that happen? But apparently, if you read the untold histories, it happens all the time, and this province is just notorious for it. So I don't know. It's distressing and depressing at the same time, that short-term interests are supplanting any kind of sort of reasoned discussion or debate, and where the provincial government is actually breaking its own laws to see these last stands of forest being cut down. And it's infuriating, it's just difficult to try to parse that with Canada attempting its international, presenting itself internationally as this fairly sort of, I guess, democratic country, when in fact it's anything but. And it is it's very frustrating, and it's it's a drag. It's a real drag.
Honestly, I think this is a worldwide problem, and people everywhere would resonate with it. We are, I think, the only country, or among the few countries in Europe left, who have virgin forests. Most of the countries just covered in forests and forests and forests, and they're old. And because of that, we have been having a huge increase in lumber mafia. We have a certain percentage of logging that is legal, but there's about 80% or 90% of the logging that is done is illegal and not on papers. And there've been reporters who were beaten and murdered, and foresters who tried to stand against them and they were murdered. And there's nothing that can be done, because in the end, the politicians are hand in hand with the people who do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that kind of cutting down of trees in protected areas, that you're right, that's global. That's and it's happening primarily because that money, that wood is so valuable. It's hardwoods and old growth, extremely valuable. So wherever the money can be made, that's where you're going to get corruption if you don't have sufficient control over those areas. So that's really unfortunate. It's interesting, though, that in Europe, a lot of rewilding is occurring. People are, percentage-wise, the number of people who are actually still farming has gone way down. People are moving into cities, and land is being abandoned in countries all throughout Europe. and so it's reverting in many respects. And I know people like George Monbiot write about this all the time in the Guardian, and he's written a book on it as well. So in that sense, there's an element that's almost encouraging, but it's not old growth forest. You know, it's not virgin forest. It's secondary, tertiary growth. But even there, you know, the wildlife can return, you know, given the opportunity. It often does. So things are changing. I mean, it's quite dynamic these days. How the world is adapting or not adapting to the changes that are sort of coming.
Well, that's another problem we have illegal and even legalized, forcibly legalized hunting. We are the only country in Europe left where black bears, lynx, and deer are not endangered. And they're being hunted like crazy by politicians, of course.
Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, I was told stories when I was touring in France that, you know, even the locals were saying that, you know, that their culture is a hunting culture. They shoot everything, right? If it's in the air, they'll shoot it. If it's in the forest, they'll shoot it. And year after year, hikers are shot accidentally, or maybe not, whatever, throughout France. And it's generally, it's defined as accidental shooting. So no charges are ever brought. And so it's just a situation that perpetuates and continues season after season of, and that's weird because, you know, I love hiking, and the only time I was really worried about being out in the wilderness was in northern Saskatchewan in the fall, which is hunting season. And so we were out there, and we had to wear, you know, bright day glow vests as our archaeology crew, because we were wandering through prime hunting areas, hunting forests around the Saskatchewan River. And I do remember stumbling upon a bear that had been shot and obviously wounded, and then crawled off to die. And we would hear gunshots, you know, as we're working all day in the forests. So that was one of the few times that I thought, you know, even having this, you know, this vest that I'm wearing, this high visibility vest, it's basically this big sort of yellow neon X right on your back and on your front, like a target, basically. So that was a curious time, that's for sure.
And I suppose that they shoot when they hear movement in the brush, so they don't have to see.
Yeah. Well, we made sure we were loud. We were very loud, making lots of noise, shouting at each other, because it was a stupid survey, so we were getting lost all the time. This is pre-GPS, so we had a compass, but we would get lost. And it was me, one guy from Saskatoon, and then two Swampy Cree, and they were the ones who would basically be able to lead us out of the forest, because we would be just so turned around and completely lost. You know, we're digging holes, so we're not really looking at much else. Just look at the ground in front of you and pace things off and stuff. And it's not a forest like you see in fantasy films and historical things, you know, shot in Ireland or in England, or even Scandinavia for that matter. It's not that kind of forest, which is kind of a cathedral style forest. So there's a lot of open area underneath the trees. These forests are, you have to claw your way through, because it's elm thickets and dogwood. And it's just, even a machete would be hopeless. You got to bull your way through, and quite often you're closing your eyes because the branches will just, you know, potentially poke your eyes out. So you just sort of pushing your way through the forest. It's one of those settings that you almost never see in film and television. And I know Cam's had experience in that stuff as well. And when we wrote our second Malazan script, it's called Black Dog Blues. It was all about our some of the squads, like Whiskey Jack squads, were fighting their way through this kind of environment. And we really wanted, if we ever get the thing filmed, we would get it filmed in northern Saskatchewan, and just go through the hell of those forests, because they were rough places to be. That's for sure.
Well, just today, people were posting something about getting the Malazan books turned into movies.
Yeah, I saw that. And I read most of the comments. It's similar to what's happening to, I think, Wheel of Time, that the most voracious fans of the books are not 100%, but they're being very hypercritical of the television series. And I find it to be a real shame, because that is potentially what can shut down epic fantasy on television. If it's constantly being trashed by fans of the genre, then it's a huge disincentive for production companies to take a chance on something like epic fantasy. And it's, I don't know, to me, what's happening right now is because of this television series, Wheel of Time, the book sales have skyrocketed. So why would the fans be at all annoyed at that? You're bringing more readers into the series, which can only be a good thing. So it's almost as if, in being that, hypercritical on this stuff, you're shooting yourselves in the foot. And I find it kind of frustrating. I've been watching the series. It's fine. There's nothing, I only read the first, I think, 2 books of Jordan's series. And so I don't have any sort of, tight allegiance to the books. So I'm watching this just as a narrative, and a fantasy narrative. And yes, once you put aside, the direct sort of Tolkien ripoff elements, my understanding is Jordan moves past that pretty quickly. So once you put that stuff aside, it's being well done. So what, yeah, it may not be exactly canon, but there is nothing sacred to that canon. And I'm saying this as an author, that I if we were to do our the Malazan stuff, if it were to get picked up, it's the first thing Cam and I, when we talked about it the first time around, we recognized that immediately, that it's not, it's a different media. So you're going to tell a story, and the story is going to be inspired by the series, but the mechanisms of delivering a narrative are fundamentally different. And so, to try to hold on to or adhere to what is put down on the page, translated into a visual format, is just unrealistic. You don't get the internal narratives that you can get in books. And if you want internal narratives, read a book, right? You can't expect to have internal narrative to that extent in film and television. It just does not exist. And there's good reason for that, because you often get the imposition of voiceovers and that kind of stuff, which is really awkward and clunky. So all you can do is you present something, and you're going to follow some elements of the storylines, but basically what you're trying to get across is atmosphere and tone. That's what you need to match between a television and a series and the books, is atmosphere and tone. And various plot elements are going to have to be changed. Other aspects will have to be conflated. Whole subplots will have to be dropped, because there's just no room for this stuff. And you're not producing something specifically for the people who've read the books. You're looking at a much broader audience, because you want those numbers, and you want new people coming to this stuff. And then if they get excited with it, then they can go out and pick up the books, which is a good thing. So yeah, I read those comments, and it's kind of depressing, the negativity. And I get it, because people, they have a visual mental image of what they've read, because in a sense we're all filmmakers as we read, right? We build the scenes in our heads, and so each one of us is out there with our own adaptation, if you will, our own film version of the books we've read, and that can never be matched, by a production company, because first of all, they can't read your minds, and secondly, no two versions are the same. So none of that can be matched. And it strikes me as really unreasonable to imagine that it could be. And then to then even to recognize that it, you cannot match this stuff, is not sufficient reason not to try and not to do it. It's as if, I'm probably going to take real, shit for this, but it's as if each person is holding on to this definitive version of the books, and there is no definitive version. Even I don't have a definitive version of these books. So none of these things are sacred in any respect. They may feel sacred because they're personal, but the whole point of film and television is to attract the largest audience possible, because that's how business works, right? It's about making a product, and it's art, yes, but it's also a product, and a product has to have a commercial aspect to it. And so quite often it's the commercial aspect that is the driving force in removing complexity from the story. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's just the nature of the business. So yeah, I'm sure I'm going to take heat for this, but I'd love to see an adaptation. And yeah, things will have to be dropped. The story will have to change. But it's, the thing that Cam and I recognized really early on was the only things we would stick to our guns on in terms of being part of a series like this would be tone and atmosphere. So how it looks and how it feels. Those things we can make Malazan. And if the story is altered and events change, actually it is of less relevance than it's got to feel to us. It's got to feel Malazan. And that, that would be our limits in terms of what we would expect. Because it would be unrealistic to expect to be able to dictate how a story is going to be put together. There are better people, there are more talented people who can do that. That's their business.
Well, I didn't read The Wheel of Time, so I have no comparison to make.
Mm-hmm.
But I have really mixed feelings about The Witcher, because I did read the books. The show is nice, it's entertaining, it's pleasant, but it is not The Witcher.
Well, isn't it The Witcher atmospherically and visually?
Yes, but they did
and
change.
Tonally?
They changed a lot of stuff that was fundamental to the magic system, and that was somewhat disturbing. Like the fact that in the world, witchers are forced into the life of magic while witches choose it. And they showed Yennefer basically kidnapped, screaming, crying. She didn't want to go there and she was depressed, and oh, how they forced her into magic. And one of the basic laws of their universe is that witches choose it for the power, it's willing, while witchers are forced. And most of them die and don't survive the transition. So I don't see why. I mean, for extra drama, how she was struggling there, I get the point, but they removed something that was essential to their world. So,
To what extent did that particular aspect affect the outcome of the stories?
not much, I would guess, but there are many, and drop by drop by drop, eventually it turns into something else. It's not bad. It's
Then
pleasant
it's
to look
something
at.
else. Yeah, then it's something else. That's fine. You know, it's yeah, it is a different medium, and you know, it's going to tell its stories in its own ways. I personally, I don't have a problem with that. You know, it's they may have reasons for doing certain things, and those reasons, they may be good ones, they may be bad ones, but you know, regardless, the stuff's being produced. You know, Martin's Game of Thrones kicked open the door on this. I mean, it was nudged open by Lord of the Rings for sure, but I think Game of Thrones really kicked open the door to the potential for a television series. And the more the merrier, you know, let's get more out there.
Agreed. I mean, it's a pleasant show to look at, but when I think of the books, it's just inspired. I would say that's a very generous word, inspired.
Yeah, and inspired by is, again, I wouldn't have a problem with that either. You know, it, regardless of what you know, if a series is going to be done, book sales will go up, which means new readers will come to the series, and that's the bottom line, you know, because then you're bringing new people into potentially appreciating the series, and then participating in discussions and conversations and excitement and you know, all that kind of stuff. And shouldn't that be what fans should get excited about? You know, all these new people coming aboard. Yeah.
More people for me to moderate. Speaking of Lord of the Rings, the movies, I have a confession to make. It's an embarrassing one, but it's a funny one, so I'll get it out there. You know, growing up here in communist Romania, there wasn't much available on the market. A lot of stuff that was seen as capitalist culture was not available in libraries. And beyond that, we had a really large library at home. My father kept buying books like crazy, so I never had to go out and get books. I would just peruse and choose one. So I don't even know if Tolkien's works were out there or not. Based on how little fantasy I see out there, I would guess that they probably weren't. Even today, it's hard to get, except for the stuff you see on TV. You don't get much fantasy in libraries. So when the movies came up, my sister's boyfriend invited us. He said, you know, these movies are going to be great. They're going to revolutionize the cinema. It's going to be awesome. I had no idea what I was going to see, other than they're going to be great. So there goes the introduction with Galadriel talking about the legend and how the ring was lost. And then the scene turns, you know, the screen turns black. And I remember I closed my eyes and I thought, God, please, please, please don't let the next scene be in modern day New York. It started so well. Don't let it change.
Cool. Very cool.
So
you thought it was going to be a Highlander version of Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Interesting mashup. I like that.
No, really, no. It's good. It's great the way it is.
Yeah.
All right. So to the first Deadhouse Gates, not even
Yeah.
Deadhouse Gates question. Another fan reached out to me with a question of his own. Ben Van Dyke's the second. He said he wanted to ask if the Malazan magic system was influenced by Zelazny's Amber universe, because in this movie, the royal family of Amber inscribed a pattern onto chaos, and that created an infinite number of worlds and variations.
Yeah, probably. I was a huge fan of Zelazny's Amber. The formation, the realization of the Malazan magic system found its origins in the gaming. So it wasn't, we hadn't actually done any fiction regarding this. This was entirely gaming. So basically, when you're in that kind of gaming mode, you do take inspiration from books. I mean, I think that's done to this day. Almost anybody sort of running a game will take inspiration from the books that they're reading. A perfectly natural phenomenon. So yeah, I would say Amber. I mean, I like Zelazny as a writer as well. I mean, not just the stories of Amber. I was very much an admirer of his writing abilities. So yeah, big fan. Lord of Light, for example, is a fabulous book. So, which is not to say that in sort of creating the Warrens and all that stuff, Cam and I, went to our bookshelves and pulled down Amber and took notes or anything along those lines. But I suspect subconsciously that was one of the fertile grounds that we explored and made use of in creating the magic system. But then, of course, we had to shoehorn it into the GURPS gaming system as well, and translate things into dice rolls and that kind of thing. So it was always going to be a mashup of some kind. But Zelazny, yeah, absolutely. Amber is great. I don't know how, I haven't read it in a long time, so I don't know how it's aged, whether it's aged well or not. But
Ben was recommending it to me wholeheartedly. He says they're great books, so
yeah,
I suppose it aged well.
Yeah, and he's a skilled writer. And again, he's very much a writer of show don't tell, and so you begin to piece these characters together, but it takes a long time to do so. And because it's also held to one specific point of view, I think for the whole series or something like that. And that's a character who actually doesn't have any memory of his relationship to everyone else. You find out why in the first few books. So because that sense of relationship with these characters that this guy then meets is one of mystery, then the reader is also sort of pulled into trying to figure out, who these various other people were or are, and it's only given to you in dribs and drabs, just very, very small interactions with these characters, and then you start realizing that there's this huge sort of spider web of relationships between all these family members. It's a great series, just in terms of not just in terms of the story, but in terms of the writing style and control of point of view. You learn a lot from those books.
Nice. Heboric is probably one of the biggest mysteries in the books. So last time we talked, I noticed that at first I used to think that Otaterol is in one hand and the other one the jade power, and they were at war within his body. But then actually both of them were in one arm, while the other he had stuck in Fenner's Warren. And I was wondering, how did they get there? My first thought was, well, they cut his arms and they went there, so that's the link. But then I realized that that's not the case, because then both of them would have been linked to Fenner's Warren. So did he get himself stuck there when he used his arm as a lock to bring Fenner down? That's when his hand sort of
Mhm.
got stuck in the water?
I think so. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. It's been a long time, but yeah, I do think so.
Um, this one is actually not so much a question than rather than an observation. Um, there are a lot of small scenes, insignificant basically in the grand scheme, but um, after a battle, Durka meets these soldiers who had been guarding a flag, a standard, and he sees one fallen soldier there, and he talks to them and tells them that, oh, I see you saw action and you defended the standard, and such proud heroes. And they they give it to him so raw. They say, you think we got killed for a flag? No, our buddy here, he was dying, and these bastards, they like to collect people and treat them so they can torture them, and we were
Mm.
having none of that, so we fought them off so he could die in peace. And I was just thinking, there's so many people who are obsessed with the symbol of the flag and all the heroism and the big pretty words, and this was so refreshing to see a more realistic take on it.
Mm. Well, it sort of gave me the opportunity to say, well, because it's the historian's point of view, the historian is sort of that first line of potential propaganda, and a historian other than Duiker could easily have picked up that scene and, as you say, written it as this heroic defense of the standard of a flag, and that might have inspired people back at home or whatever. And so I wanted to subvert that, so that the soldiers actually have the opportunity to say, no, wasn't the case here, and this was something far more personal. There's a different approach. George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman, especially even in the first novel, he plays on that all the time. And most of that novel, well, the second half of it, relates to, I guess it's the Second Afghan War. And it's basically, it was an inspiration to a lot of the Chain of Dogs, because it was a column of British soldiers, as well as a whole bunch of civilians, basically marching through Afghanistan, exiting the country, if you will, heading for the Khyber Pass, and salvation in British-controlled India. And it turns into an absolute nightmare. But the Flashman character, the character of Harry Flashman, he's all about sort of presenting this facade of heroic soldier of the empire, when in fact he's this craven, treacherous coward. But there's a scene where, and I'll spoil it for people, unfortunately, but towards the end, where they're defending a fort, and he's among the last of the survivors, and he's grabbed the Union Jack, he's grabbed the flag, and he's actually running towards the enemy that's pouring over the walls to give them the flag, right? So take it, go ahead, take it. But then he falls unconscious. So he falls unconscious, and then the flag is sort of at his feet when there's a counterattack, and they retake the fort. And so they find him there unconscious, defending the flag to the last, right? And so he ends up getting, Victoria Cross or something along those lines, right? And it's all false, it's all fake. And the books are his, his memoirs. So he's actually coming clean and all this stuff. And I always loved that scene. I absolutely adored that scene. And I was probably thinking about that when I was doing that scene with the flag, because for me, it was one of the best parts of the first Flashman novel was that scene. And so yeah, I probably took that as inspiration. But it's that dichotomy, that tension between the recounting of events and the reality of those events, and the fact that those two very different things, and they're driven by two very, very individual, I guess, agendas. And one might be the complete opposite of the other. And we have to bear that in mind when we read our histories and our newspapers and articles and all the rest. So.
This might be a little detailed, but I'm gonna try it anyway. As Duiker is taken by the warlocks on their trip to kill the scent god, he hears the tribes outside their encampment wailing and grieving and having their rituals for their dead. And he notices that even though the Wiccans had lost a lot of people throughout the journey, they never grieved. They never took the time to have these funerals for these rituals for the dead. And he asked Nether, I think, why don't they do that? And she says, Cultain forbid it. So I was wondering, why would Cultain forbid the grieving?
Not yet time. Not yet time. In order to keep going, in order to keep fighting, in order to keep defending, some things have to be put on hold. And I think in this case, Cultain is either consciously or subconsciously recognizing that grief is a massive expenditure of energy, and they cannot afford it. And they will have to hold off, and they'll have to wait. And I think, historically, we've seen this. We've seen this where grief has to be put aside until the entire thing's over, until the battle's done, until you're getting off the plane and are back home. And there's a huge psychological impact to holding off on that kind of grief, but that's what war forces upon people. And it's extremely destructive, but Cultain has to do it. But at the same time, as the writer, I'm recognizing that none of them are going to make it anyways. So, in that sense, he was right to do so. But yeah, it's about being then prepared, to pick up the weapons again and do it all over again the next day. And if you're spending each night grieving, that gets harder and harder. And he couldn't afford to have that happen to his people. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I was thinking it might be one of the reasons. The other would be that once you start grieving, you start realizing how many you have lost. You lose hope, and with hope, the willingness to fight. Or they could be so angry for their loss that they start blaming the refugees for all the pain that they're feeling. So there are a lot of side effects to grieving.
Yeah, there are.
There are a few scenes in Deadhouse Gates that, I had a hard time understanding them. When I was explaining them to my husband, who is on his first read, he too struggled understanding them. So this is one of them. I'm just going to explain the way I got it, and you can tell me if there's something wrong about it. The killing of the scent god. So Sormo takes them all by Warren, I suppose, to a place where an old high Omtosfelak ritual was slowly unraveling. Duiker turns behind and sees this huge mountain of ice and the corpses jutting out in different stages of decomposing. And Sormo explains to him that the Semk god was a powerful ascendant a long time ago, presumably, my presumption, during the wars of the Tlanimas and the Jaghut. That's why they would have risen the ice, right? And that he wasn't powerful enough to escape the rising of the ice or to stop it, but he was still powerful enough not to die. So he had been trapped in that ice for a very long time, and he was crazy and out of his mind. And that they devised this way of dealing with the Sem god. They had summoned the spirits of the earth, of the land, and they in turn ripped him apart piece by piece and consumed him. And that's how they actually killed him, or thought at first that they killed him. Is that how it happened? Well, and in doing this, the spirits of the earth, of the land, they got extra power by consuming the god's power. And at the same time, Coltane gained more power over them by way of alliance, since they can always say, we gave you power, now you have to defend us. So it worked both ways for them.
Yeah, I don't remember that second bit. Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. I can't recall whether the Semp god was originally an earthbound spirit of the region, with the ice basically entombing that god. And so the Semp god was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the ice just imposed itself upon that god's I guess native home, or that god was a personification of the outrage of all those earth spirits that were then given the opportunity to rise up and dismantle what they had created. I don't remember specifically, but your interpretation sounds fine.
Sormo tells him that he was a powerful ascendant of old, so I suppose he might have been an ascendant back then.
Yeah.
There's something else that Sormo says to Duiker about the high Omdosvalak rituals that seems to be some sort of foreshadowing, but I cannot really connect it to anything. He tells him that these rituals never really die. They rise and subside and rise again. And he tells him that there's one such ritual rising right now on a different continent, and that he has dreams about it, and that this rising of the ritual is going to cause a lot of death and destruction. And I'm wondering, what continent is he talking about, and what is he seeing in his visions? Because on Lether, the ritual is dying, it's not rising. Could it be a sail where the ice is growing? Okay. Speaking of magic systems and The Witcher, there are certain concepts that are common in different types of fantasy books, and there are two that I've seen in The Witcher that do not, well, one is in the Malazan books but changed, the other one is not at all. The concept of not being able to take power from nothing, that you have to take from somewhere in order to direct something somewhere else. In The Witcher, they take from the elements or from life itself. You grab a flower, you consume it, you can do magic. In the Malazan books, you basically draw upon Krull's blood. So in a way, the concept does exist. And in the Malazan books, the fact that you keep drawing on a god's blood who is eternal, then the limit you can draw is up to you, and it's not limited like if you pick up a flower. So I was wondering, why did you choose to go with this limitless amount of power, which can only be limited by the strength of the mage rather than the availability of power out there in nature?
I don't know. I can't tell you what the conscious choice was, you know, for Cam and I way back when. But I would think, I mean, basically what you're describing is kind of the laws of thermodynamics applied to magic. And at the same time, when Cam and I were thinking in terms of a magic system, we didn't want the limit to be an external force. So in other words, the limit is what the person can bear. And so it's all down to the individual choice. And that struck, I guess, it certainly strikes me as a more human approach. If you externalize the limits, it kind of implies that if there were no limits, then that individual could and would achieve omnipotent status if they were ambitious enough and had the capacity to do so. And because a lot of the thematic sort of approach to the series was that we're all our own worst enemies. So the limit would be the frailties of the human condition as opposed to anything else. And I think there's enough examples in the series where if you don't view it as magic, but just view it as resource acquisition, which you can see magic as the same way. The resource there is Cruel's blood. And as long as Cruel is alive, the blood continues to flow and is reproduced and is regenerated, if you will. But that's not how the real world works, is it? You know, you use up all the resources and that's it. You know, you're done. And that was certainly, there's that kind of storyline or that kind of thematic approach appears throughout the series. It's about resource exhaustion. And in other words, it's not the limits or lack thereof externally presented, but it's the limits or lack thereof internally from on the basis of the human condition. And that if the acquisition of those resources is by choice unlimited, then there are consequences, and those consequences are it all comes to an end. You use up those resources and you don't get them back. So I think that there's very good reasons for why, now that I think about it, why we chose that route. We wanted to throw the responsibility and the consequences back on the person and not have an externally applied limitation to their ambitions. So yeah, that would be my answer.
And the second one, and I'm far from an expert in fantasy stuff, but I think this might be specific to East European lore rather than the more, English speaking side of fantasy, is the concept of the law of surprise. Because I've seen that in our fairy tales in a lot of varieties. You help somebody, you save their lives, and what will you take as payment? And then it can be what you have and you don't know you have, or the first living thing that greets you on your way home, or the first thing you find when you arrive to your destination. All sorts of variations of it. What destiny decides. So this is a theme I didn't see in the, and not that it should be, just a curiosity. Basically,
No,
the
you didn't.
curiosity is this specific just to us, to East Europe, and that's why it's not so heavily explored on in the only the, the English speaking side of fantasy, or am I just imagining it?
No, I think it's there. It's I'm immediately brought to mind the Arthurian saga. So surprise, unintended consequences, or almost misdirection of the storytelling, so that the reward is not necessarily the obvious choice. Is that kind of what I'm reading from what you're saying?
No, it's the payment of debt through something you do not know, and that
Ah,
something usually results in a child or a wife or something of the sort. A human, you come home and the first thing that comes greeting you is your little 3-year-old, and now you owe your 3-year-old to the person who saved your life. Or you come
yeah,
home
no,
and
that's pretty universal, actually. Um, I mean, that's biblical as well. But it's also, you'll find it in Norse mythology, and you'll find it in the chthonic stuff out of the Greek myths. No, it's prevalent everywhere.
this one is also not really related to Deadhouse Gates, but and probably you haven't been, I mean, not asked, just discussed, the difficulties that we non-native English speakers face when reading the books. I mean, for me, most difficult was the geographical descriptions, plant life. I always have to Google images. How does this look like? At first, I
Do
didn't use.
you have examples? Which plants? What kind of plant life?
There's a scene, I think, in the Bone Hunters or Reaper's Gale where Karsa meets the Anibar and he decides to travel to their land to help them with their Edur problem. And you give a pretty detailed and beautiful description of the land with the soil, which is basically quartz coming up and little shrubs and juniper growing everywhere, and two other flowers, one which is yellow flowers, I remember the images, but not the name of the plant, also bushy stuff. And once I looked for all these things, the land came alive. It wasn't just words. It's quite important, but if you're not a native speaker, it makes it really difficult.
Yeah, I bet it does. Yeah, that's that region is it's basically boreal forest. Precambrian shield is what's the terminology that's used here. So yeah, it's hodgepodge of lakes, most of them spring fed, and bedrock, pillowed bedrock for the most part. So yeah, I probably went into a lot of detail there because I knew intimately what I was describing, because I've walked that landscape, most of my life. So but yeah, I could see that would be certainly challenging. If you've never walked that landscape. Have you been to Scandinavia at all?
No.
No. Parts of Sweden are very similar, similar style landscape. And yeah, that's definitely growing up in Manitoba. And yeah. So I find that curious, though, that that's the stuff that is the most difficult in terms of translation, because that's basic geographical terminology and landscape terminology. I thought you were going to say, it's the naming conventions that I'm using for characters that really, because that's more often than not when a translator contacts me, it's relative to naming question or naming conventions. They have a hard time with those.
Names are names. Either you pick up on the meaning behind the name or you don't, it's still just a name. The difficulty would be in maybe imagining how an English native would pronounce a fantasy name. That's a little, head twisting. But names of flowers, names of trees, there's so many, and most of us don't know these things. Maybe we know them in our native language, but not in English. It's not something common, not something we come across.
Yeah.
And if you ignore them, if you don't look for them, images, not just the name, then it loses charm. You miss on a lot of stuff that you're otherwise putting effort into, and improves the whole experience. But if you don't look for them, it's difficult. And I remember the first English books I read were Martin's Game of Thrones. And I was so angry with him. He uses so many different words for horses. How many types of horses can there be? And eventually I realized that I'm just being lazy. Because after all, we have the same words in Romanian. Why should he limit himself to horse? It's ridiculous. And I thought, now I've learned names of horses, types of horses. I've learned the different armor parts, all sorts of medieval architectural things. Now I'm ready for anything. And then I started my lesson. I was like, okay, I'm not ready for anything.
Yeah, and Cam's expertise is different from mine. So the combining of the two has certainly helped flesh out that world for sure. So, Cam writing his nautical stuff, his naval battles, sailing, all that kind of stuff. And his conventional use of armor, terms of armor, that certainly was sort of added onto whatever sort of knowledge basis I had, that I brought to the world building. And so it certainly benefited from having two different people contributing to this thing for sure.
This one is a hard one. I'm not even sure if I know how to properly express it. Are the magical aspects truly alive? Not as in the dragon guarding them being alive, but the magic aspect itself. So sure, it can be argued that the magic stems from the guardian dragon, but is it really so? Sorit was the guardian of Serk, and Icarium and Mappo found her dead, crucified in a skykeep of the Chenchemale that had been encased in the eyes of the Jagat. Okay, Icarium speculates that the Edur were the ones who did it. She was, they chained her to a cross made of blackwood, but that meant that only Oserk was left to guard the warren of Serk. Now, say that Oserk would die as well, the magic of air and sky would not disappear. The warren would be unguarded, but the magical aspect would still be there. People could still draw on it. And we know that there are certain warrens like Mokra or Denul or Meanas which feel alive. Can they actually be literally self-aware in a magic way? Unrelated to the dragons.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer to that. Whether they can be self-aware or not. I mean, there's two things at work here. One is the verisimilitude of magic in this universe that we're describing, and the need to have it internally consistent in that respect. But on the other hand, there's the metaphor aspect of what magic represents, that goes just beyond the Malazan world, but applies to the entire genre, where magic, a fantasy where magic is active. And so both of those, I guess, have dictates, force particular ways of describing and dealing and thinking about the magic. And it then just becomes a point of making sure that the two don't contradict each other. So, and that is why the magic in the Malazan world has to remain mysterious. Because if it didn't, and if I explained everything, or Cam explained everything, and we laid it all out for you, then the metaphorical purpose of magic in the fantasy setting is lost, because it's all about mystery and wonder. That's what magic was there to evoke in those early stories and the legends and all the rest, and that's how we want to use it. So we cannot explain too much about magic. It defeats the purpose, at least our purpose.
Well, one can only try. There's a really cool concept in the scene where Culp is thinking about how to pull the Cylinder out from the nascent. He keeps thinking, I'm not a powerful mage. I don't have a type of magic that is, elemental, powerful, that I can do anything with it. I create illusions. So how can I bring this ship into the real world by creating illusions? And he wonders if you can trick reality into non-reality, that if you can trick the magic itself, which is what made me think if maybe the magical aspects are alive. Because if you can trick the real mind, then the same concept applies to the magical aspects. If they can be tricked, that they can be at least partially, somewhat, in a manner of speaking, self-aware.
No, they don't have to be self-aware for that. You can approach this from a quantum point of view. You can approach this from the notions of consciousness creating reality and altering reality. You could even approach it from the theories of our reality being a virtual one, being a photonic one, and being able to hack reality in some fashion or another. If you could reach that sort of point of recognition, that level of recognition where you could actually hack in matrix style reality. So again, it does not have to be a conscious living thing. The only thing that has to be involved is the participation of something that's conscious. I know it sounds weird, but it's more a question of Culp wondering whether he can hack reality. That's the best way to put it, through illusion.
It's a very interesting concept.
Well, yeah, and I made fun of it in the Willful Child books, right? Their transporter device is called the Insistion, and basically it attempts mathematically to convince the universe that you're not at point A, but you're at point B, and that's how you pop over to point B, by arguing with the universe and winning the argument. So yeah.
One detail I really liked in that scene, so Culp pulls the cylinder into Meanas, and in doing so he causes a tear of cosmic size, and then the undead dragon, and I really don't know how to pronounce her name, you'll have to help me with that one, Olar Ethil, the Bonecaster.
Olar Ethil, yeah.
Okay. She realizes what's going on, and she channels her power into Culp. He just rises, spread eagled in the air, surrounded by blue flame, a really cool scene. The dragon ahead of them, her tail going like a serpent, curvy. Behind them, the tear into the warren. And Gessler, he sees the whole thing. He notices that the dragon is looking at them, which is really dangerous. And he just looks at her and he waits. Hello. Mm-hmm. That was such a cool comic, funny moment.
It's the kind of stuff Cam and I would have done in our gaming. I think it happens. There's one in Bone Hunters as well, where somebody waves from a ship, or moons another ship or whatever. Right. So that's the kind of stuff Cam and
That
I
was
threw
stormy.
into, yeah, threw into our gaming a lot, just for laughs.
Well, it
And
worked.
well, also to undercut, to sort of rehumanize. You know, you go for a big visual, but you still need to humanize it or rehumanize it. Otherwise, the individual can be lost in that huge landscape. And I guess, you know, if you were to think ahead to The God Is Not Willing, and you think of, spoilers, but Stillwater, in the healing section, again, it's rehumanizing everything and bringing it back down to a particular level. I think those gestures are important, at least for me as a writer, that I have to remind myself that these are, you know, that we have to be at that eye level. We have to go back down there at some point after we've gone way up there. So.
It relieves the tension
Mm-hmm.
and it humanizes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also a bit of a wink to the reader as well, right? So
Yes, it is. Before I move to the next scene, and I have several questions in it, I wanted to talk about something else. A little over 2 years ago, before the COVID madness began, I was at the office and one of the girls asked me about the books. Now, I choose carefully who I talk to, who I recommend them to, because if their English level is not up to the point where they can read them, then it makes no sense. They'll just be lost, get frustrated, give up. Maybe, I don't know, later when they improve, they can attempt, but if they get frustrated at that point, it makes no sense. So I don't recommend them to everyone. But the girl had heard me talk about it and she came to me and she asked me, what are the books about? Now, that's always a very difficult question to answer in a short, compact answer. So as I was talking to her what the books are about, she started looking at me with a really weird expression, and it was getting more intense as I was speaking until I stopped and I asked her what's going on. And she had this big smile on her face and she asked me, where did you find it? So I thought, okay, that's a weird question. I found the series on an online library. I just saw the image of the books. They were cool. They seemed fantasy. I wanted fantasy. I wanted something big. They were big. That's it. It clicked. And then she said, no, where did you find it? So that was really confusing. So where did I find what? And she looked at me with this big smile and she said, maybe you don't realize it, but you were glowing. As you were talking about these books, you were glowing. That is passion on your face. And, a lot of people look for that all their lives and they never find it. So when did you find it? So I started thinking back, well, I enjoyed fairy tales as a child. I read a lot of those and I had these vinyl discs with stories and I liked those. And before that, at the age of 3 or 4, my grandfather read me these Serb legends and there was some fantasy in those too. So I guess I always liked it. But eventually what I realized, and I think it's the case, I don't think it has to do with a passion for something, but rather a personality trait. And if you're a person who's passionate about stuff, you're going to find things that flame that passion. They make it manifest. And if you're not a passionate person by default, then not a lot of stuff is going to awaken that. So
I think everybody has something that can trigger that passion. And it's just a question of finding it, I think. But I think everybody has that potential.
My friend, she was telling me that she has sought all of her life something to feel passionate about, and she never found anything. And in those 20, 30 seconds, I spoke about the books, my face lit up. She said I got completely transformed. And she was saying that she in a manner of speaking, she envies me because she had sought that kind of passion all her life and could never find it.
Well, I don't know, maybe her passion is finding that, seeing and witnessing that passion in you. You know, it doesn't need to be a material thing, right? It can be something that's far more ephemeral, far more based on interaction and emotional responses of people, and bathing in that emotional response. And I see nothing wrong with that. And that's, you know, it's, you know, when I see somebody having a great time, I mean, I enjoy seeing that, right? I don't have to be part of it, but I can enjoy seeing it.
True.
Yeah.
Okay, back to Deadhouse Gates. There's a paragraph where Fiddler thinks that Iscarol reminds him of Quickban, always having plans within plans. And God knows both of them remind me of Shadow Throne. So we see mages of all sorts using the other types of magic, but they don't have much in common. But in the case of Shadow, or at least the powerful mages of Shadow, because Culp uses Meanas as well, but he's not like Quickban or Iscarol or Shadow Throne, they seem to share certain traits of personality, or at least a manner of thinking. Is that by design or just coincidence?
No, it's by design. Shadow is it's all about the liminal. It's all about the spaces in between. And that's a difficult thing. Those are difficult aspects to pin down and to, you know, it's a shadow is a negation of either or. And so, you know, the mindset that actually delights in that negation is it's going to be drawn there, right? So when I think in terms of creating characters who are involved in that particular warren or with that god or along those lines, it does sort of influence how I'm going to sort of think of them as in terms of personality, in terms of their characteristics. They're going to be hard to pin down. And even somebody like Culp, Culp was probably a bit more straightforward, but I also knew his time on the page was limited, so I didn't have to put that much more into him. But the ones that really were going to carry a lot of thematic luggage would be characters like Quickben and Iscarol Puss for sure, and Shadow Throne, because we don't see much of Shadow Throne, right? He pops in and out, but he doesn't spend a lot of time on the page. So I need stand-ins for him and his mindset. And Iscarol Puss is certainly one of those. He's a stand-in for Shadow Throne. Just to remind you that this is, you know, this is a high priest of Shadow. So this is one very close to the god, Shadow Throne. And so that's how you can often use characters as stand-ins for other characters if you don't want to, you know, keep bringing those other characters back. Because everything we see with Iscarol Puss and all his scheming, it on the surface it appears to be entirely of his own making, but you quickly or eventually realize that no, this is because Shadow Throne has instructed him to do things. So.
And Quickman, he too was a high priest of Shadow at some point, so it makes sense.
Apparently, yes.
Apparently what? Apparently he was a high priest, or apparently it makes sense?
No, apparently he was a high priest. I can't tell you when, can't tell you where, but
back when Dancer and Kellenvid were still flesh and blood, there's a scene, I think either in well, something in Seven Cities, Deadhouse Gates, or House of Chains, or maybe Bone Hunters, where I think Lostara Yil, she has some memories, or Dance, no, Cotillion has memories. When Quickban came and put an end to the cult of Rashan. And
Mm,
back then, Quickban was the high priest of shadow. That's why he was welcomed.
mm.
So we do have a scene where everything is pinpointed. Sorry.
It's okay.
Um, in the same scene, Fiddler thinks that he imagined that Iskaral's and Quickban's existence is constantly filled by if this, then that suppositions. And I was wondering, I think this is a default of human being. It doesn't have to be just theirs. It's how we learn. We get exposed to an experience, we see how it ends. We repeat the experience in different circumstances, we see how it ends. So this is how we put things together. If this happens,
Mhm.
then most likely that is going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm saying this in a weird attempt at linking this to uh, a discussion, not an argument I've had on Facebook these days. An image, a story of the fable of the frog and the scorpion,
Hmm.
but a retelling of the story where the scorpion does not kill the frog, and when they get to the back on land, he says, I'm not going to kill you because I may not be able to control my nature, but I can control my actions. And I found that to be so non-realistic. I mean, it's beautiful, it's idealistic, it's naive, it's sweet, but definitely not realistic.
Um, I don't know. I think there's a Star Trek episode, original series, um, that makes that kind of the central statement. I think it's a Battle of the Archons. It's the episode where, have you seen the original series?
A long time ago, yes.
Right. Well, they visit this planet, sort of they gate crash this planet that tries to tell them not to go there. And when they land, they discover that this planet and a rival planet nearby have been at war for hundreds of years. Um, but they didn't like the destructive elements of the war, so they used a lottery system. So it's entirely computer generated wargaming, but there are actual real consequences. So in other words, if the computer says this city was hit with a thermonuclear device, then this percentage of the population is now dead. And those people then have to walk to these disintegration machines and step in and disintegrate. Um, and of course, uh, by arriving with their ship, the computer basically indicates that they are casualties of war. So the Enterprise is going to be destroyed, and all the people on board are dead, including the people down below or whatever. But and the story, of course, is Kirk refusing to accept this absurd notion. And I think he gives this speech, and basically it's the same message: is that yeah, you can. I could be conflating two episodes, but he says something along the lines of, yes, you can kill, but not today. And that's basically the statement he's making, is that you have this capacity, but you don't have to do it today, not today. And then the next day you say the same thing, not today, and not today. And I think that it's not a question, I think, of realism or not realistic. It's a question of, to what extent do you actually possess free will, or are you simply, this uh, biological machine that is driven by these impulses, to which we have no control. And so I think that what's being argued there with the scorpion and the frog is, is that you may have the capacity to end the life of this other thing, but you also have the freedom to choose not to. I mean, isn't that what it means?
I saw it as a warning that people will usually act, not always, but usually act on what their inner nature is. It doesn't have to be negative. I mean, look at it as somebody who's kind and whose habit is to help everybody. You help someone and then they hurt you in return, and for a while you promise yourself you'll never do it again. Eventually your nature is going to drive you to repeat the same action, even though you know you might get hurt again, because it's the impulse of nature of who you are. Whether
Well,
the nature is positive
mhm.
or negative, it's hard to fight. Maybe occasionally you can fight your nature, but most of the times we will act based on who we truly are inside.
We may have to agree to disagree on this one. I'm probably a bit more optimistic than you, and my my response would be if you're doing the right thing and in terms of an action, but don't receive the rewards for it, to me that's insufficient reason to not do the right thing the next time.
I wasn't thinking
In
of
other words, I'm not necessarily doing it in expectation of reward. I'm doing it because it's what I choose to do, right? So it's almost as if that's the extent of my agency, and I don't have control over anything beyond that. And therefore, the expectations should not be the dictating forces of my actions. So in other words, you do things not in anticipation of reward. You just do them because for you, they're the right thing to do.
I wasn't thinking of reward, but rather of fear of being hurt again.
Sure. But quite often you do it anyways. And I think there's plenty of examples in human nature of people who do that. I mean, some turn it into a profession, firefighters. They will go into the flames and they'll do it again and again and again at great risk. So
And that's the point I see in the fable, that whatever your nature happens to be, whether you're a savior or you're selfish or you're aggressive or whatever your nature happens to be, eventually it will push you into acting along the lines of who you are inside, and escaping it is maybe something you can do here and there with a lot of effort, but most of the times people will act based on on what their nature dictates.
well, yeah, that's where we're not going to be on the same page, because I think your definition of nature, I read that differently from how you'd read it. Most people, at least my sense of if you're going to talk about nature in that respect, it sounds almost deterministic in a sense. And I think we have proclivities, but I don't think we have hard, fast rules on these things. If we did, then we would be automatons, and we would respond the same way to the same stimulus, the same phenomenon, with no alterations in our responses whatsoever. But that's not the case. So there's wiggle room in terms of our personality base, in terms of our nature, if that's what you want to call it. Because if there wasn't any, then we'd be sort of sociobiologically bound in the same fashion that ants are, in an ant nest, and we're not. There's far greater variation and flexibility. So proclivity, I would say, is where I sort of, think in terms of human nature, tendencies to do things. But we can be mindful. We are capable of that, and so we can, by being mindful, you're you're guiding your actions or your responses to the specific instance that you're experiencing at that time. That's what being mindful is all about. So in that sense, you can choose. You have the freedom to choose.
My thinking of nature was more along the lines of, we're all basically a tight core of emotions, and those are born from our past experience, and of course they evolve. My nature is not the same as it was 20 years ago, yet those emotions are the ones that usually guide us into reactions, and going against that emotional impulse is very difficult. And I think we can only achieve it on occasions when we force ourselves out of what seems our natural path, but otherwise it will usually push us in the same direction. Just an example and advice that, my sister, she went to see a therapist for a while, and at the end she gave her an advice, and she told her, next time you meet a man and he seems familiar, and it seems like you've known him your whole lifetime and everything just clicks, run away.
Run away as far as you can. Yeah, because it's basically there are patterns of behaviors and patterns of recognition, and quite often it's you can be drawn to the wrong flame over and over again, right? And there are origins of that, I guess, that go back to when you were a child or whatever, and those establish those particular patterns. And I think a lot of therapies is definitely related to helping the patient recognize the signposts and the signal flags for those patterns, and then just being at that point becoming aware of them, and also then becoming aware of what that visceral response you might happen to have with those things. It's like being able to pull the mechanism away from being triggered, for example. So in other words, one becomes aware of the circumstances, and you can see it coming, or you can see at least how your response might be coming. So, and I mean, the example I can use in that respect is, I used to be triggered by vehicles backfiring, cars on the street. When I came back from Central America in '83, I'd already gone through a period of lots of gunfire when I was in the jungle on the roads. And so I remember coming back, and a car would backfire, and I'd be prone onto the sidewalk just instantly, and just drop. And it's just taken a long time to recognize that that this is just an autonomic response, and it's an instinctive response, and so quite literally triggered. And over time, then to recognize that any kind of repetitive loud noises like that can really wire me up very fast. And so now I recognize these things, so I'll avoid finding myself in sort of situations where there's that loud sort of sharp reverberations that are being repeated. And so I become sort of mindful of the fact that I'm going to have a visceral response to that noise, and I should just leave. Simple as that. Because I just get more uneasy, and if you recognize that there are visceral responses, and adrenaline can kick in, and adrenaline has certain effects to the body and all the rest, and it's not a fun place to be. So you do what you have to do to sort of step outside of that and get away from it. So yeah, that therapist was absolutely dead on for your friend.
That's my sister. Well, in her case, she herself graduated from psychology, and the therapist was impressed with her understanding of the mechanisms, and the first thing she did after the therapy was over was find exactly the kind of man she was told not to find.
Mhm.
So that's proof that nature will not always, but most often push you, even when you know, even when you're fighting it, even when you're aware, usually it triumphs.
Well, but at the same time, what nature are you describing there? Because there is clearly a reward mechanism that's being triggered by that type of relationship for that person. That's feeding a particular need in that person. Maybe there's a visceral excitement to it because of the risk, because of the dangers involved. Or it may be that because it's familiar, familiar is it's something that actually can make a person more comfortable. You know, it can be, yeah, it can be, you know, from the outside looking in, it can be a horrible situation, but if that necessity for comfort is greater, then the person stays, right?
Yeah, it's the comfort of
Regardless.
the recognized role, the comfort of the learned pattern.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm always reading and studying all these sort of aspects of therapy and the means by which we manage to navigate our lives, and you know, and how psychology approaches that, and how psychiatry is somewhat different. Psychiatry seems to be more the medicated approach to that, but psychology, it's always been something that I have to sort of stay sort of up on, because I tend to use aspects of it in the fiction I'm writing a lot. So, in fact, you know, The God Is Not Willing involves some fairly direct aspects of therapy and dealing with trauma. You know, it's definitely front and center in that novel. So,
All right.
10 more minutes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll leave the Deadhouse Gates stories for later. I was watching one of AP's and Philip's videos, and there was this scene that AP was referring to from Lord of the Rings, where right in the beginning, where Sauron comes and he swings the mace and all the soldiers fall, and he was saying that's so disappointing. And I remember that at first I used to think the same, that, you know, this is a powerful magic creature and he battles with a mace. What's going on there? But then, because I'm quite the fan of Lord of the Rings and I've seen them, I don't know, somewhere between 20 and 30 times, I lost count. In one of those views, I noticed a detail that escaped me each and every time before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that when Sauron swings the mace, he's quite far from everybody else. There's a magic ripple of his swing that throws all those soldiers in the air, and he holds the mace in the hand that has the ring. And the words that precede that scene is Galadriel says, "But the power of the ring could not be undone." And then he swings. So basically it was magic that threw those people in the air, which means they did it right. But the scene is so confusing, you would think that he hits the people with the mace.
Mm. Mm.
So,
Oh, you have to drop AP a note then.
well, he'll probably see this.
Mm.
All right, so I suppose this is it for today.
Okay.
I'm going to wish you a happy Christmas, you and your family.
And you. And you.
And I suppose I'll see you next year.
Yes. Yes. All right. We'll do it then. Okay.
All right. Have a nice
All right.
day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.